You are listening to Talking Images, the officially unofficial podcast of the ICM Forum. I'm Chris, and today we have a bit of a different show for you. We have taken on the daunting task to try to talk you through the entirety of Spanish horror history. History that started shockingly late. While there are plenty of Spanish language horror films from the 50s, 40s, and even earlier, the majority of these are from Mexico. Spanish Dracula from 1931? Why, that's a US production with a Spanish language cast. In fact, the only Spanish film that was made before the 60s and is occasionally referred to as a horror film is A Tower of the Seven Hunchbacks from 1944, and even that's highly questionable. So how then did Spain go on to become one of the most prolific exporters of European horror cinema? To answer that question, we went back to the very beginning, and it is rare that any period of cinema has such a clear starting point that Spanish horror has. In 1962, the first ever Spanish horror film was produced. In fact, the first ever two Spanish horror films were produced, and by the one and same director, Thesis Franco, the prolific, and when I say prolific, I mean prolific, he has well over 200 credits, cult horror favorite. Thesis Franco essentially started and ran essentially the entirety of the Spanish horror industry for years. I mean, he is the driving force of 1960s and even 1970s Spanish horror, even though so many joined him later. To take this as seriously as we possibly could, we sat down and actually watched the first ever Spanish horror film, The Awful Dr. Orlof, and some of us even made it through to the second Spanish horror film of 1962, The Sadistic Baron von Klaus. And not only that, we also sat down to watch one of the latest and greatest Spanish horror successes, The Platform. But we'll save that discussion for the very end. With me today are three wonderful co-hosts. Clem.
Hello, I'm Clem. I'm from France, and I'm really looking forward to talk you through the Spanish horror history.
Tom.
Hi, it's Tom from Manchester here. Really looking forward to exploring Spanish history with you all today.
And last but not least, Saul.
Hi, yes, I'm Saul. I'm from Australia. I've been watching films for about 19 years and have been interested in horror films ever since the beginning. So this would be a very exciting topic.
So let's just get this started by giving our early impressions of The Awful Dr. Orlof.
I thought it was really interesting watching the Dr. Orlof film as a pioneer Spanish horror film. What I sort of found when I was watching it is that it wasn't really that much of a horror film. Most of it's a police procedural drama with the detective trying to find this Dr. Orlof character. One of the things which I said a couple of days ago is the most awful thing about Dr. Orlof is the fact that he spends half the film absent, to spend it with this detective and his love interest as they try and track him down, which is the least interesting part of the film. I thought it was interesting, though, that there was a part where the detective is given this newspaper article which complains about him spending all this time with his love interest and not on the case. Interesting stylistically, I thought the beginning of the film was really well done. The sort of dialogue-free intro. We see this woman being kidnapped by a shadowy figure, but sort of after that doesn't quite go where you want it to go, because then it becomes all about the detective rather than Dr. Orlof.
So Saul summarised what happens in The Awful Dr. Orlof quite nicely. So I'll offer my opinion on what I thought of the film. I'm a huge horror fan. Horror is probably my favourite genre, so I was quite excited to go back and watch what was the first Spanish horror film. It did start really well. The opening scene was quite gripping, but then after that started with the overly long exposition and characters who you didn't really care for. It became difficult to become emotionally invested in the events of the film. And as Sol said, the element of horror is kind of lacking. You don't really see much in terms of violence or gore. Perhaps that was quite normal for that era, but there's nothing that really horrifies or scares in this. And to be honest, it feels like quite a tepid entry into horror for the first Spanish outing that we see.
I'll join in with what Saul and Tom already said about the film. I thought some parts were just straight out boring, with some story that the viewer didn't really cared about. Well, at least I didn't cared about, and it is not what I'm looking for in a horror film. I think it's still an important film to watch, as it's a piece of film history for Spain. But as an horror film in itself, I'm not sure it's deserving of the hype some are giving it.
Well, yeah, I think that the only reason this film consistently pops up on Spanish horror films you need to see is because it is the first. There's not much else really going on here. And I would also really like to focus on one thing I thought was absolutely hilarious here, the amount of just incredible exposition. Like just from the very first scene, or the very first scene where our heroic lead is introduced, where he and his lady love just walk us through the entire way they met. And then later on, you see the bad guy, Dr. Orlof, go through with one of his assistants the entire history for about 2 minutes, just explaining the entire motivation of everything he's doing, as if none of them knew it before. The amount of exposition in this film is absolutely incredible. One thing I actually thought was really fascinating here is that Franco made 2 copies of the Awful Dr. Orlof, one specifically for Spanish and British censors, and then an additional one for slightly sleazier or slightly more open-minded markets, where he included a lot of even graphic nudity, I suppose some slight, I'm not sure what else he cut, but let's just say that there's a clean version and then there's a sleazy version with a lot of, I would almost say, surprising gratuitous nudity.
Just thought I'd mention, based on something which Chris was saying, that it probably only crops up in all these film canons because it's a pioneer horror film. I actually thought it was quite well done stylistically, with a lot of shadows, darkness, some really great interiors, some great side long distance shots of them carrying the bodies at night. However, these really good parts are only ever very intermittent because it is such a detective story. But I think there's quite a bit of interest to it. Maybe not top 100 horror film canon worthy, but I thought it was an interesting film, just a very highly flawed film, as you'd probably expect from a pioneer horror film from a country.
I think I would agree with you, Saul, but I think that the other film that we saw, the Sadistic Baron von Klaus, fit what you described even more.
Absolutely. I think that if you compare Awful Dr. Orlof to Sadistic Baron von Klaus, you see incredible progression just in terms of cinematic techniques. The Sadistic Baron von Klaus is a genuinely well-shot film. It's lovely to look at. It does nothing that is extraordinary, but it feels like just a thoroughly competent, well-made film.
If I remember correctly, the general consensus after watching the film was that it was quite average. I think Yoko appreciated it a bit more than we did. But overall, I remember we were quite surprised that how well made it was. We also, I remember we said stuff like, this doesn't feel like a Franco film, because we were so used of what he would do later on in his career, more sexploitation type of film. And here we had a well shot black and white film, which wasn't really such an horror film. It was more of a thriller type of film. I remember us being quite surprised at how well made it was done. Average for its time, yes, but nicely shot with an okay story. Honestly, I think it is one of Franco's underrated films.
One thing that both of us also caught on is that both the Awful Dr. Orlof and Sadistic Baron von Klaus were set in completely different countries. So the first was set in France, the second was set in Germany. And when we did some research into this, we found something quite interesting. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it, Clem?
To talk about what we found, I think it's important to give a little context about what Spain was going through at the time. Back then, films during the 60s and the 70s were mostly made to be exported. At the time, Franco was in power. They didn't care about fantasy films or films because they thought they were inoffensive and without any social impact. They only had one requirement for those films to be made, is that the film should take place outside of Spain. There were 2 reasons. The first reason was that any underlying social commentary was impossible. Well, at least they thought so. And the second reason was that they didn't wanted any monster or any beast to soil the ground of Spain, which is why so many horror films from this period are located in different countries. As you said, France or Germany.
And this also made it really easy to export them. The majority of early Spanish films were co-productions. They had cast members that were known in other countries as well. And it made them fit incredibly well in with what was happening in Italy, in West Germany, and across this really core group of countries that would later be known as the Eurohorror countries.
Yes, as you mentioned, a lot of these films were co-productions, and most of the time, two versions of the film would be made, like, for example, the Dr. Orlof, a more explicit version in terms of violence and sexuality for the European market, and a more censored one for the Spanish market.
The only other Spanish horror film that I think I've seen from the 1960s is a movie called English, The House That Screamed. I'm not sure how to pronunciation correctly for the original title, so I won't go with that. I found that to be a quite disappointing horror film, but similar in ways to Dr. Orlof because it's not really a horror film, but half of it's a mystery film. This girl enrolling at this boarding school and students seem to be disappearing. I don't see anything horrific until the second half, and it's only really the ending of the film which really puts into horror territory. Most of it's just are at a boarding house. Some parts of it are really strange also, like the teenage girls, their shower with their clothes on. Maybe because it was better for the censors at the time, I don't know, but I just thought it was an interesting companion piece to Dr. Orlof. Isn't a straightforward horror film because it's mostly a detective story.
But I saw it at the time when I was exploring a lot of giallo films, and I was in that period of my life, and I really loved horror, and especially giallo. And to me, it fits so well in with that canon of films. It had the same kind of oozing, heated atmosphere, you know, the kind of odd sexual chemistry that you will feel in Mario Bava and Lucio Fulci films. So I thought that it did capture that really, really well.
All right, Chris, there is a lot going on in The House That Screamed from a sexuality point of view. It's just that as a horror film, yeah, it's more giallo in the crime thriller aspect, but again, not really in the horror aspect until really the ending 5 minutes. Even reading through some of the letterbox comments and IMDb comments afterwards, a lot of people were praising it as a horror film were based on that last 5 minutes, whereas it really isn't a horror film until then, which is just really interesting, just again to compare with the Dr. Orlof film, which is also not quite 100% a horror film.
I think that also an interesting commentary on horror films in general before the 1970s really carried it away. Because if you look at, say, everything going back, especially before Psycho and Peeping Tom, most horror films were in the thriller, horror, kind of weird Twilight Zone where they're intermingled. Same with Giallo. They all started out as a combination of crime procedurals or thrillers that then carried into something that was slightly more horrific.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that in general, especially if you think about things like the Val Lewton horror films of the 1940s. A lot of it wasn't very explicit horror, and yes, it probably wasn't until Peeping Tom, where we got to see things from the killer's point of view, that we actually get that explicit horror building up in the 60s. I guess maybe culminating in the 1970s with stuff like The Wizard of Gore from Herschel Gordon Lewis, which is actually an interesting, again, a bit of a companion piece maybe, or compare and contrast to Dr. Orlof. Again, it's about a character doing some really horrific things, and again, it's focused on a detective investigating it. But in The Wizard of Gore, what the antagonist does actually is really explicit, it is really shocking, and it is really interesting. Also, really interesting postmodern horror film. But yeah, again, that was in times yet to come, and that was 8 years after Dr. Orlof.
So for me, I suppose it was the 1970s where Spanish horror really took off. Two of the most notable films in this period kind of ramped it up in the terms of sadism and what was shown on screen. As Sol mentioned with The Wizard of Gore, things were getting a bit more brutal and traumatic for the viewer by this point. So the first one I'd like to mention is The Bell from Hell, which was made in 1973. Now, this is a fascinating film about a young man who is released from an insane asylum, and he returns home to get revenge on his aunt and her 3 daughters, who may have declared him insane to steal his inheritance. It's a really playful film, quite a black comedy, but there's some strong elements of horror throughout. And I thought an interesting fact here is that the director, Claudio Guerin, he actually fell from the bell tower on the last day of shooting and was killed. And the film was actually finished by another director, so it was a shame that we never got to see any more work from him, because The Bell from Hell, it's an accomplished work. It's not without its flaws, but it showed a lot of promise and showed how Spanish horror was evolving. The next one I wanted to mention was Who Can Kill a Child, quite an infamous film from 1976. It's obviously got sort of quite a lot of cultural significance, but it's still thrilling for modern audiences. It involves 2 tourists who arrive at an island where all the children have gone insane and are killing the adults. It's heavy on atmosphere and there's quite a lot of violence, and it's one that I would also highly recommend.
It's also worth pointing out that Who Could Kill a Child is made by the very same director who did The House That Screamed.
That's an interesting point, Chris, because I really liked Who Can Kill a Child, but I didn't get that much out of The House That Screamed. Very different films, and I guess with the 7 years between them, horror genre had come around a lot around the world, and I guess we see that reflected in Spanish horror cinema also, because Who Can Kill a Child is very horrorish. I think from memory, it still takes around 20 minutes to actually warm up and get them on the island. So the first quarter of the film isn't really horror-like, but the last 3 quarters really is. And it is a really interesting film with a lot of the power of it coming from the way the kids seem to communicate just through looks and stares at each other without communicating out loud, which makes it a lot creepier. I also think it's really great how Tom gave a shout out to Bell from Hell. That'd be one of my favorite films that I've discovered for the first time this year. I agree that it works really well because it's a black comedy in a way. The practical jokes that this guy has been released from the insane asylum is playing on his relatives. And there's one part where, I burst out laughing where he's trying to scare this neighbor by saying that all these children have died, and the mum thinks that they're going to come back as ghosts, and they start appearing and just gets terrified, leaves. Thought I'd also just mention that it also played out a lot to me, or reminded me a bit of Harold and Maude, which only came out a couple of years before Bell from Hell, just with the very morbid sense of humor, again playing very ghoulish practical jokes. Things take a bit of a different spin in Bell from Hell, and a lot of it's also about the way society works in general. I think one of the lines from it is, there's no difference, there's only rules, when he's asked about right or wrong. It's about pushing those limits of morality and limits of, I guess, what we think is acceptable, which is very interesting just with that progression of Spanish cinema and horror cinema around the world, with things getting much more explicit in the 1970s.
By the way, anyone remember if Who Could Kill a Child was set in Spain?
I have no idea. It was set on an island.
I recall now it was also the main characters were English tourists. Because I just remembered that Who Could Kill a Child was made in 1976, which is the year after Franco, the dictator, not the director, died. Meaning that, if I recall correctly, Spain at this point was no longer a dictatorship, and perhaps they had started to have more artistic freedom as well.
That's actually a really interesting point, Chris. I haven't seen the film recently, but maybe we could look at it metaphorically and say, well, maybe the children are like the Spanish people, sort of reacting and rebelling, not against the adults, but I guess against Franco after his leadership ended.
We spoke earlier about the characteristic of Spanish fantasy and horror cinema. Back then, when Spain was still in a dictatorship, there were 2 main themes in Spanish horror cinema. The first one was revenge, a being from the past coming back to avenge his death, usually done in a violent fashion. And the second one was a strong eroticism, which could be seen as a way to challenge the sexual repression that was going on during Franco dictatorship.
One thing that was interesting here is that with Franco passing, the amount of horror films Spain were putting out were actually starting to slow down. So when you look at the amount of Spanish horror films actually produced, they hit the high in 1973, 2 years before Franco died. In the later years of the 70s, the production amount slowly started to decrease until they almost disappeared in the 80s and 90s. Which is really interesting. And I think that it might just have been a general norm because we see a similar trend in Italy as well, where you just had this extraordinary amount of giallo leading into slashers, etc. in the 70s and 80s until in the early 80s, this horror scene just disappeared. So it might just be that Eurohorror as marketable cinema started to decrease. But we see this almost not quite sudden, but very clear and very steady decline at the end of the 70s. One thing that also starts happening, and this is a bit of a strange trend, is that during the 70s, the majority of horror output from Spain was in the B to C movie territory. This was the Eurohorror drive-in cinema that US citizens were exposed to. But in the 80s, after this rather extreme decline, we started to see some very artistically interesting pieces of Spanish horror cinema, including In a Glass Cage and, of course, Anguish.
So, In a Glass Cage is another one of my favorite film discoveries from this year. It's a really interesting film, and it's not really a straightforward horror film. It's more like a psychological thriller. Going into it, I was heard it described as a more serious Apt Pupil, a Stephen King adaptation from the 90s, which piqued my interest, and it's about a Nazi, and it's a very interesting film because the Nazi has tried to commit suicide. He's now in an eye and lung, and he can't breathe, he can't move for himself, and a young man comes and volunteers to be his nurse, and there's something definite going on between them, but the film keeps it very elusive for about the first third, maybe even the entire half, what exactly is going on and how the young man knows him. It's a really interesting film, more for the things which happen in the second half, which you can't really talk about without spoilers. But that's when it really turns into horror territory. It all culminates in an extremely interesting ending. The ending is really interesting because it's all about the cycle of abuse. And there's a child who is the daughter of the Nazi, and the role that she ends up playing within the whole revenge or getting back scheme that the young man has with the Nazi. So it all gets involved. Nobody escapes from the violent cycle. And some people have described the ending as really disturbing with what happens. I think it's just thematically really appropriate. And it was a really haunting film. The other 80s horror film that I've seen from Spain is actually one from the early 80s called The Sea Serpent. I'd not highly recommend it. It's a very lame, low-budget film, but just showing what Spain was doing back then. It's actually set in Portugal, off the coast of Lisbon, about this gigantic monster coming and attacking, causing chaos, and there's music score, which is sort of a copy of John Williams' score to Jaws. The monsters really doesn't look very good. It's really poorly done. And when the lead actor first reacts to it, you don't know if he's reacting out of fright or whether he's just shocked at how poor the monster looks. It's got Timothy Bottoms in it, and the lead actor is a really great actor from the 70s, The Last Picture Show, The Paper Chase. A very good actor. I don't know who got tied to the production, but it's an interesting film just to see where the depths of Spanish horror ended up plummeting. And I don't know if I would recommend it myself, but the film's apparently very popular in Portugal. I've got a friend over there who was telling me for years that I have to see it because it's such a big film from them, because it was filmed at the coast of Lisbon and he knows different locations in there. Looking at it objectively, it's a very weak point, especially considering 2 years later we go from The Sea Serpent to In a Glass Cage.
I think that's also such a really good comparison point to what happened to Italy at that point, where these American actors or international actors came to Italy and here Spain to be able to get a quick paycheck essentially and take part in something that would be easily put together and thrown out. We see this in Italy too, among others, Joseph Cotton, and there's a long list of other actors. And then it ended. And it ended suddenly, and it ended, I'm not going to say grotesquely, but it was over. And we start seeing films like In a Glass Cage, instead just a few years later. And we can just see the difference. I mean, In a Glass Cage is just beautifully shot, beautifully made. It's a really, really, really good film.
That's a really good point, Chris, in terms of how beautiful In a Glass Cage is. It actually looks very luscious. There's lots of striking blues in there, lots of dark rooms, really good settings, and yet it tells a really horrific tale at the same time. So yeah, extremely interesting film, extremely artistic, the complete opposite of The Sea Serpent from 2 years before.
The very next year, one of Spain's most interesting, most revolutionary, most meta horror films were produced, Anguish. And once again, this was a film that was made for international audiences. While shot entirely in Spain, if I recall correctly, we have an entirely English-speaking cast, and the film was shot in English. Now, what makes this film so incredibly special is that it ties and blends the reality of cinema with the reality of the real world. Our two lead characters, if you will, or our eyes on what is happening, are two young girls who are watching a film at the cinema. And then what they are seeing starts to merge into reality.
As Chris said, Anguish is one of the highlights of Spanish horror cinema from the 80s. From the offset, it's unclear where Anguish is headed. At first, we're presented with what appears to be a graphic Italian slasher flick, a giallo, but then the initial storyline segues into another in an unconventional yet intriguing fashion. And as the link between the two storylines becomes more tangible, this is kind of where the fun really begins. Throughout Anguish, there's a central motive of hypnotism, and this is established by our introduction to the killer's mother, who is played by Zelda Rubinstein, and she possesses the ability to control the mind of her doting son. This gift is used for evil purposes, and the power she exerts over her son is strong enough to spill over into the minds of other submissive individuals. One of the film's standout scenes is perhaps an exaggerated portrayal of this hypnotism in action, where viewers could be forgiven for fearing that they too might succumb to the twisted grip of her psychic power. Along with the fascinating visual effects, it is Rubinstein's acting talent that adds credence to these spellbinding scenes. She's well known for her role as the medium in the Poltergeist series, and her creepy performance in Anguish demonstrates once again why her presence can be so beneficial to genre films that require a distinctive character. Chris mentioned that it's a self-referential meta-horror film, and films that blur the line between horror fiction and reality became more popular in the mid-90s due to Wes Craven's Scream and New Nightmare. The genre continues to thrive to this day. Films such as Rubber and The Cabin in the Woods attract a cult following among horror fans. But back in the 80s, when the idea had not really been explored to its fullest, Anguish's astonishing amalgamation of fiction and reality should have sparked a series of imitators, but instead it kind of remains almost like an anomaly in the genre, an overlooked and perhaps often forgotten horror, but one that has been reappraised over the years and stands out as one of my personal highlights of 80s Spanish horror.
And let's not forget just that incredibly tense atmosphere. Like, this is one of the tensest films I've ever seen. As you pointed out, you almost start becoming paranoid yourself. And I just cannot imagine the experience of seeing this in a theater, being in the exact same situation as the protagonists. That must have been true, pure horror.
I always think that if there's one film that I would have loved to have seen in the cinema for the first viewing, it would definitely be Anguish. I can't imagine how it must have felt if you'd gone to the cinema back on its first release, not knowing what you were about to see, and then to sit down and witness that crazy film. It must have been quite a traumatic and memorable experience. So if there's anyone listening who ever gets the chance to see some kind of retrospective and view it in the cinema for the first time, I would jump on that opportunity straight away.
And if you have seen it, try to bring your friends. Of course, one of the reasons why Anguish just disappeared, which is truly tragic, is because the cinema at this point appeared. There's even 1 year in the 90s, I believe 1993, where not a single horror film was produced in Spain. But then something changed. There were 2 relatively successful films that came out, one in 1995, The Day of the Beast, which is just a crazy dark comedy. It's a little bit childish, a little bit juvenile, but it's an incredible film. And then, on a slightly smaller scope, Thesis, which in some ways took several pokes at Spanish cinema and utilized the same kind of self-referential style as, say, Scream, where you have people studying films, obsessed about films, becoming entangled in a similar story.
My first thought when I was watching The Day of the Beast is how big the budget must have been when the film was made. And I find it very interesting to see how Spain went from those cheap B movies in the 60s to more high budget films 30 years later in the 90s.
So The Day of the Beast is a really interesting horror film because it's got very strong comedy overtones to it also. There isn't a lot of Spanish horror films, I think, before that point. There's such a pronounced comedy angle in there. All about a priest trying to make a pact with the devil and having to learn to be evil. And it's really mad. It's a little bit over the top. It's really funny. It's got an ending in there, which makes you go, well, I don't know. It's a very memorable ending in there. I recently saw another horror film by the same director, which has again got a lot of comedy in it, called The Bar. It just seems to be something which Spaniards, I guess, these days at least can do really well with, introducing the comedy and intertwining it with horror.
Just jumping in to mention that the director of The Day of the Beast is Alex de la Iglesia, who I sadly haven't seen any other films from, but is considered to be one of the essential cult directors of Spain, especially for people who got into films around the mid-90s and continued to watch this kind of cult horror comedies in the early 2000s.
The Day of the Beast was the first Alex de la Iglesia film that I saw, and I absolutely loved it. And since then, I've sought out pretty much every film that he's worked on. And it's interesting that Sol mentions the streak of black comedy that runs through his films. There's a lot of humour in there, and he tackles a lot of different angles from a horror perspective. So there's one called The Last Circus, which is closely linked into the Spanish Civil War. There's one called Witching and Bitching, which looks at witchcraft. And it's just interesting to see his take on all the different angles and perspectives of horror. Linking it back into Thesis, it's kind of interesting to see the different paths that those 2 directors have taken, because while Alex de Glazer has stayed to his Spanish roots and continues to make films in Spain, set in Spain, the director of Thesis, Alejandro Amenabar, he then went on to make Open Your Eyes, but then he also worked on the others and kind of went off to Hollywood. So it's interesting to see the different paths that both of those directors took from their early days.
A deal of irony there, isn't it? Because in Thesis, there is a scene where one of the professors at film school specifically says that Spanish filmmakers need to start making the kind of films that people want to see, because Spanish cinema is destroyed and Hollywood is crushing them. And then, of course, he goes on to, leave and join the winning side. Amenabar left for Hollywood. Thesis, along with Day of the Beast, do seem to be the beginning of some kind of artistic reignition into the horror genre in Spain. Because just a few years later, we started to see some of the most breathtaking, interesting, and critically acclaimed horror films coming out of Spain. I'm talking, of course, of The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, both made by Guillermo del Toro.
So Guillermo del Toro is a Mexican director, but he is fascinated with the Spanish Civil War. And this is an event that he'd come to know as one of the most horrific yet unrecognised times in history. something he had grown up reading about and hearing about. So he wanted to explore the root of it and try and reflect that in his horror films. And it's interesting that the supernatural horror that is present in his films is often secondary to the stark situations that innocent children find themselves in. As Chris mentioned, the cinematography in his films is absolutely breathtaking. He shoots films that are genuinely unsettling and creep under your skin, and he continues to create excellent films, although he's moved away from his obsession with the Spanish Civil War.
In 2007, interesting happened. 3 of the most notable Spanish horror films are made in one go. The Orphanage, Timecrimes, and Wreck. 3 completely different films. The Orphanage being a really well-made, beautifully shot, restrained, well-acted, just this traditional horror story. Timecrimes being this sci-fi holocaust of emotion and tension. And of course, the found footage film Wreck, which played a major part in the resurgence of the found footage genre and has spawned several sequels.
Chris is absolutely right here. We're all excellent. Wreck, for me, remains one of the few films that has truly terrified me. It's an incredibly tense found footage horror set in an apartment block where there's a breakout, an infection that seems to be spreading through the inhabitants. And the apartment is put on lockdown. By pure chance, a fire crew go to answer a call there, and they are filming a documentary about the experiences of the fire crew and capture all of the action on camera. For those who have seen it, they will know there's a scene towards the end set in the attic of the building. The first time I saw it, I was left on the edge of my seat. Couldn't move, just waiting to see what was happening.
I didn't find it to overall be an extremely effective film. The first half of it was really great. I loved the whole idea of the ambitious reporter trying to carry on this news story. I believe there's a part where there's a woman crying and she tells her to stop because she needs to record it because the microphone didn't pick up the woman crying. So she's just completely oblivious to all the horror going on. And yet in the second half of the film, she sort of becomes a victim of the horror. It's an interesting dynamic. I found the second half of the film much weaker. A lot of the found footage stuff is things like I've seen already. And the attic scene, I guess it is technically well filmed, but that sort of ending is just something which I felt was really familiar and which I'd seen a lot. Yeah, it's a hard one to reckon with Rec, trying to work out just how good a film it is. It probably was one of those pioneer films, and maybe if I'd seen it earlier in my film going journey, I would have liked it more. On the other hand, you've got a film like Timecrimes. That one made a really huge impact on me. I'm a really big fan of time travel films and time paradox films. I don't want to give too much away, but the film explores some really interesting dynamics in there. It does reveal quite early on there is a time machine, but the way it works, I'm not going to reveal because that's best left unspoiled. But you're sort of watching the whole time going, it's just going to be a 12 Monkeys type of film where, you can't change time at all, or Back to the Future type of film where you actually can change time. Because time travel, I've got all these different possibilities. It's an extremely interesting film. The third one, The Orphanage, I was actually not a big fan of that either. And when I saw it, I thought, oh, there are some interesting things there. You're not sure what she's imagining, what's real, what's not real. But I found the whole thing really sentimental, really maudlin. Didn't sort of really end with a lot of horror pronounced there. And I actually saw it after I saw the film The Impossible with Jeremy Watts from the same director. And I just thought, oh, it's like another sentimental film like that, which is a bit of a shame because there is a bit of atmosphere in there. There is some ideas about spirits lingering like echoes, but a lot of that I've also seen earlier on in films like Poltergeist. So Orphanage didn't do too much for me. Wreck did a little bit more for me, but I think Timecrimes, unfortunately I can't discuss too much without spoilers, is really my favorite of those 3 films.
I'm quite curious, Sol. I'm wondering whether you've seen any of the other Rec sequels, because Rec was so successful that it actually spawned a number of follow-ups. Rec 2, I think, is almost up there with the original. I'm not in any way comparing these films to the films I'm about to discuss, but I like to view them from the perspective of Alien and Aliens. So Rec introduces a story, and then Rec 2 just does something completely different with that story, takes it to another place that for me was really surprising, and I got a lot out of that. The follow-on films try again to do different things with the franchise, removing themselves from the found footage perspective, but they don't really come across as well as the first two films. So have you seen Rec 2 or any of the follow-ons, Saul?
I have the second Rec film on DVD. I bought it as an ex-rental on the cheap quite recently, but I haven't sat down to watch it yet. So it actually might be something I'll watch this month. I wasn't going to prioritize it because, like I said before, the first film didn't exactly wow me. Now that you've mentioned it does something different, that does pique my interest. I'll put the second Rec film on my watch list now.
Your comparison between Alien and Aliens is really good, and unfortunately, I found Aliens lesser of the two. I think I agree completely with Saul in that it was the first half of Rec that was really interesting. That's where all of the world building and the suspense were coming from, and then in the last half of Rec 1, you just get pummeled with all of the standard cliches, if you will. But it's done really well. But that's largely what it is. You feel the terror, but it is what you expect. And then I really felt that in Rec 2, it just continues down that line. It lost that kind of special tension building, this larger world of the first film, and then goes all in for the horror elements.
It's interesting, Chris, that you mentioned the sheer terror from Rec and Rec 2. And I think perhaps that's maybe why I'm a little forgiving when it comes to the film's inherent flaws, because it is just such a terrifying experience watching it that it's easy to become wrapped up in the sheer horror and the moment. And for me, that's what happened the first time I watched it. And the second one, perhaps not so much as terrified, but I was so invested in these characters and excited to see where the story went, and I wasn't disappointed. I think following on from Rec, the next notable horror for me is Sequestrados, or Kidnapped, which is English title. Now, it came out in 2010, and by this point, the wave of home invasion horror, it's kind of passed. It was kind of at the end of the life cycle, so to speak. But this, for me, remains one of its high points. It's a brutal and traumatic experience. It's a film that is made up of 12 long takes, and this enhances the tension and the realism as we see a family who are assaulted by a gang of outsiders after their money, and we learn more about their motivations as the film goes on. It's really quite a sickening and twisted film, quite explicit in parts, but it's one that if you do enjoy brutal films, I'm sure everyone who likes that kind of thing will get a big kick out of this. So the director of Kidnapped, Miguel Angel Vegas, for a while I thought that he could have been a great Spanish director. After watching this film, I was eagerly awaiting to see where he was going to go. But to be honest, his follow-up films have been quite disappointing. You may know him for the director who tried to remake Inside, the infamous French horror, to little success. And since then, he seems to be mostly working TV. So sadly, it seems to be a bit of an anomaly in his career. But if you haven't seen Sequestrados, I can't recommend it highly enough.
Thanks for those comments on Kidnap, Tom. It sounds like a really interesting film. It's not one that I've come across in my journey so far. I've seen a few other 2010s horror films from Spain, possibly most notably Bleak Tight, which is from the same director as Rec, but does something very different. It opens up with this guy sleeping in the bed with a woman. He gets up, he showers, he goes down for his job where he's working at the front of the hotel or building that she lives in. And then she sees him, and you suddenly realize that, oh, they don't actually know each other that intimately. And as the film goes on, you see how he abuses his power working in the hotel or housing building just to get into all the guest rooms. And that's really interesting because the film plays on the insecurity that we might feel in our own homes, and we actually should be the most secure place that we could possibly be. And there's an extremely intense part where he gets locked in a room when the woman who he's targeting is there with her lover and he has to try and talk his way out. It's a very interesting film. Another one which borderlines horror would be The Skin I Live In from Pedro Almodovar. That's a hard one, again, to talk about without giving too much of it away. But it's sort of like movie Vertigo in a way, with a bit of a horror edge to it. At least it reminded me of that a lot with some of the music score stuff and the way the protagonist would look at the female character, an observer. But there's a lot going on there, which I can't really get into without talking too much about and giving too much away. I also recently saw Julia's Eyes, which is produced by Del Toro. That's a really stylish film. It begins off really well with this woman investigating her sister's suicide and believing that she didn't really kill herself and somebody else was there. And there's apparently this person following her who can't be seen properly because he's sort of invisible. Film loses its way as it goes along, and the whole invisibility thing becomes a metaphor for how people get ignored in society. Lots of decent thrills and chills throughout, especially in the first half of the film. And there's a whole lot of eyesight things going in there, which I haven't even mentioned. And the other one I might just give a quick plug to is a film called The Bar, which is from the director of Day of the Beast, about all these patrons who get trapped in a coffee shop, but basically two people get sniped. Snipers attack them from outside their coffee shop and they get too scared to leave, and there's lots of paranoia about what's going on. Why isn't there anybody on the news reporting any of this? And then there's an infection there, and it loses its way a little bit once the characters decide they know what's going on. But again, like Day of the Beast, it ends with an ending which sort of also flips everything a bit on its head. So quite a few interesting Spanish horror films. And we get up to something like the Platform, which was recently put over on Netflix, which we'll be discussing in a lot of depth really soon.
One thing I found interesting about Sleep Tight is that the main protagonist of the film is the bad guy. We know that what he's doing is wrong, but however, since he is the protagonist, we kind of want him to succeed in a way. We don't want him to get caught. I think Saul mentioned a scene where there is the main character facing the woman's lover, and I remember feeling a bit of tension, hoping that the main character would actually escape, even though, given what he was doing, the normal thing to do would be to hope for him to get caught. But here, since he's the main character, we kind of root for him, let's say, and hope he's not getting caught. So I thought it was an interesting take on the home invasion film. Usually we, in this type of films, we see the family perspective, but it was the first film I saw which tackled the home invasion genre by using the bad guy, let's say, perspective.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Clem. It's a very interesting film from that point of view. We really feel for the Louis Tosar character the whole way through, and we want him to survive this. We want him to get out, even though he's doing all these terrible things. I guess he just becomes a really interesting character, the way everything's meticulously planned. Maybe it's because it's the way it's set up, and he's the best developed character. Yeah, everything that's really interesting. We end up really rooting for him. And there's from memory, there's a little girl in the building who knows what he's up to, and you sort of don't want her to dob him in. So we sort of want him to succeed. And I guess we just feel he's a really lonely guy. Sort of got that impression from him. What he's doing is maybe just a way of expressing his feelings and wanting to be a bit more closer and a bit more intimate with people and not knowing how to. Yeah, I found him, thoroughly encapsulating character, and I really wanted him to succeed, which, yeah, as Clem said, you ordinarily wouldn't want that sort of character to succeed at what he's doing.
So moving on to what in many ways would be the climax of this week's episode, The Platform, one of the most recent and most successful Spanish horror film. Like I mentioned in the beginning, we all sat down, we all watched it, and given what we discussed at the very beginning of this episode, where no films were allowed to be set in Spain and no films were allowed to critique the status quo, this is such a beautiful finale because, if anything, The Platform is one of the most clear and obvious social commentaries in cinema history. Our lead character wakes up in what appears to be a prison cell, and there's a hole in the floor. He has one cellmate, and every single day a platform comes through his cell, through this hole, and is covered in food, eaten food. It's disgusting. If I recall correctly, they're on floor 48, which is not from the bottom, but from the top. Both characters peer into the hole and see an seemingly endless amount of floors above and below them. And then something starts to develop. Let's do just a quick roundtable of the film, starting with Tom.
I thought the platform was a great sci-fi horror. There's a fascinating concept at the core, and the director exploits his allegory to maximum effect with the horror that he puts his characters through.
Sol?
Platform was really interesting because getting into it, I had some preconceptions of what it would be like. I thought it'd be a bit like the Vincenzo Natali film Cube and a bit like Snowpiercer with the lack of food supply and how that changes. By the end of the film, I ended up getting a slightly different vibe from it.
The Snowpiercer comparison is quite good, though. It's really similar in some ways, but we will not get into that. That would probably be spoiling the film a bit too much. I do think, though, that one part of the logic of the film, that's not really a spoiler, it's worked into it right away, is the fact that the floor these two cellmates are on will change, and it will change every single month. It's also important here to understand that just this massive platform filled with food is always coming from the top. And the lower down you are, the less food you will get, because everyone above you will have taken their pick first. And one of the most interesting, and I suppose one of the main things that they want us to take away from this film, is when the cellmate tells the protagonist that he should not speak to the people below them because they are below them. And they should not speak to the people above because they won't listen, because they're above them. And regardless of which floor this person seems to be on, he hates the people above for being above him and being bastards, and he hates the people below because they're below them. And it seems to have a very clear point that wherever you are in society, that's your point of reference, and that the people above you are just above you, the people below you are just below you. And that runs through the film so incredibly well. And I suppose it's taken to its extreme by the fact that these people will be anywhere in this extreme class hierarchy at any given point. Every single month, their place will change, but their impression, or at least impression of the cellmate, hasn't changed.
So the journey that we take through this unsettling architectural nightmare follows what at first seems to be kind of a kind-hearted man who strangely volunteered to enter the platform, but he soon regrets this decision as his amicable nature is pushed to the very limit. The foul conditions of this brutal prison take its toll on his mental and physical condition, particularly as, when Chris mentioned, the inmates are relocated at random to a new level within the platform every 30 days. And the director subjects us to all kinds of depravity as we witness violent deaths and decapitations alongside abhorrent defecation and even attempted rape. So I suppose viewers of a sensitive nature might want to steer clear of this one, but those who are open to dark and delirious rides through hellish scenarios will surely relish the twisted delights on offer here. And it's strange to think back to the first ever Spanish horror film that we watched yesterday and compare it to where Spanish horror is now. The contrast is just huge. There's no other way of putting it.
Platform is really interesting for the way we see how Spanish horror, like Thomas said, has changed so much over the past 58, almost 60 years from Dr. Orlof. It's not really so much of a horror film. It's not really critical of Spanish society, to the platform where it's very highly metaphorical for everything going on in society and the problems with greed and sharing and people above, people below, and not communicating properly. I did have some issues with the film. which I don't think it properly resolves and left me a little bit wanting. I wasn't sure, I don't think it ever really quite made it clear what the purpose of the building was, which was something I sort of wanted to find out a little bit more of before the end. Is it's this great big experiment or not? But I guess not knowing the answers is sort of like not knowing the answer to the meaning of life. So maybe that does need to be answered. What did really plague me, and it plagued me more in the days since watching it, is that our protagonist brings along a book into the platform because everybody's allowed to bring one item. He brings a book. All these other people bring knives and weapons and ropes and things to climb. What I was wondering is, how did they know to bring a weapon? How did they know to bring something to help them climb? And yet he didn't know anything about that. I was really unclear on how much each of the characters knew about before going into the platform, especially because he volunteered to it. His first cellmate was put in there without really getting the chance to volunteer. Yeah, a lot of things which weren't quite clear to me, and I wasn't sure if that was on purpose or the way it was done, because we get sort of bits of information revealed to us along the way.
I can see where you're coming from there, Sol, because there is quite a lot of ambiguity throughout the film, but I think that adds to the sense of mystery, and also it places the viewer in this position where it's a puzzle and we are trying to work out exactly what is going on behind this platform. And that, for me, it drew me into the film because I was eager to find out more. And although you're right that it was kind of unsatisfying that we didn't get all the answers that perhaps we were hoping for, I felt that the direction that the film went in kind of worked perfectly with the setup. I don't think it could have ended any other way, really.
The impression that in this film's universe there was still a fascist dictatorship. You could hear them all talking about this administration. And especially one of the character who was working for them talked about how she had been working for these people for 25 years and the kind of things that she had seen. And that also ties into how much people know, I suppose, because, like was mentioned, our main character volunteered. The majority of characters who are in there seems to have been criminals, people who committed some crime or another and were sentenced there and got this as a choice. So it could be a case where the criminal or the people who get sent there through the court system has some additional information, but the people who go in from the general public, they simply don't know because of the misinformation they've heard. It's very clear from our main character that he has no idea what this is. He joins this project because he wants to quit smoking. That's his reason for joining. Other people seem to be joining because they want to lose weight, while the majority are there because they were sentenced to be there.
One thing I will point out, and I think that's a good point, what I believe Tom mentioned, that it's really hard to imagine another way for the film to end, and it possibly is better not having all the explanations, because it's like in life you don't really understand everything, you're not always told everything, and yet you still get the basic idea, you still get basic gist of what society's like from watching it without knowing everything about it. What's interesting is that there is one IMDb review which reckons that the people who are promoted to higher levels in the platform are actually the ones who are more violent with killing their cellmate or trying to survive. It's like the more violent you are, the higher you go up. The less violent you are, the further you go down. But I have no idea how they could possibly measure it, but it's a very interesting theory.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that logic holds up, but I mean, it could be, without spoiling anything, that could be true. But it's something that's really, really hard to tell. I think one of the characters that seemed to end up quite high at one point had not hurt anyone before.
Again, I don't know. It's just a theory. I don't know how reliable it is. I might rewatch the film at some stage.
I really like how the platform can work on more than one level, because you can just sit back and enjoy it and watch it for a spectacular horror film, enjoy all the violence, the gruesome aspects of the film. But then you can scratch under the surface and look into like the political allegory behind it, and it adds meaning into a bloody and violent film, and it elevates this spectacular concept to almost make the platform become a thought-provoking picture with quite a valuable message at the heart.
It has a really valuable message, or at least it opens up some really uncomfortable questions. I mean, throughout this film, you see characters trying to interact with each other between the platforms, between the cellmates, etc. And you get this idea of what could make this work. Because what is known right away is that the lower the level you are on, the less food you get, the more scraps you get, the more likely you are to get violent, the more likely you are to go insane. And you have this dynamic that where your actions could save lives. The people on the top could choose to indulge themselves less and ensure that the people below them got more food and could live like decent human beings. And it's even set up like that with plates for every single person in this system. But they don't. I'm not going to get into what happens towards the end of the film here because that would be a pretty extreme spoiler. But what we see is that it asks the questions, how can people form a kind of solidarity to help others survive and themselves survive? Because this is the thing. Your position in this hierarchy changes. The decisions you made when you're on top, all the people who place in those exact same positions. And does anybody remember the moral theory about this? There's a really famous thought experiment by John Rawls, The Veil of Ignorance, that I just couldn't stop thinking about throughout the entire film. Essentially, there's a way to help people think about how they can design, a fair society, a just moral system, if you will. Essentially, you place yourself behind a veil of ignorance. You don't know if you will be rich or poor, black or white, healthy or ill, etc. And then you create the rules of the society. And the idea is that the rules you set will be more fair because as you have your own self-interest in mind, if you end up unable to work, say you were disabled, you would like to be taken care of. And I just find it so incredibly ironic because these characters are literally living inside a veil of ignorance thought experiment. Only that, in this film it's real. And so many of them are still not able to create a system that, in the end, could save their lives.
Yeah, it is interesting what you're mentioning, Chris, about hierarchies in society and not knowing where you are, and that it is really hard to work together without knowing where you are. And the film does a bit pessimistic to me, which is probably, I guess, realistic then. If you think about things like communism, socialism, it sounds great in theory, but it doesn't work because society doesn't actually get along unless people are motivated to get up higher and achieve higher than other people. So that's deflecting a little bit from the topic and getting a bit more into politics. But I think it does also point out why it might be logical the way the film does end without all the answers and without necessarily it being the happy resolution that we might be looking for when we go in to watch it.
At the same time, though, I can't help thinking that by being this bleak, the film is trying to make you realize that this is really counterproductive and will end up hurting you. I can't really think of another reason why this film would exist and be presented in this way if it wasn't trying to spark the same kind of spontaneous solidarity that certain characters are trying to spark within the film. Or at least show just how terrible the repercussions of not showing solidarity can be.
Something else which I thought was really interesting about Platform was the fact you've got all these characters who are volunteering for it. It's a bit different from a movie like Cube, where they just wake up in the room. When you've actually got characters who are volunteering to be an experiment, it changes the dynamics a little bit. I thought that was one of the most intriguing aspects of the film. Why would somebody sign up for something like this? A diploma, maybe, maybe to get a reduced jail sentence. I found the motivations, the characters to be really interesting. That's probably one of the things that I would have liked to have seen explored in a bit more depth. I thought it was very fascinating, something which really distinguishes it from a lot of the other closed room mystery films that have been made over the past years.
Yeah, I don't think we can actually cover Platform much more without getting into pretty extreme spoiler territory. So the last thing I will say there is that, as others pointed out earlier, it is incredible to see how Spanish cinema evolved from 1962 to 2019. You can see a really interesting thread where Spain starts up essentially copying other countries. The Alpha Dr. Orlof was actually created because Franco had seen some Hammer horror films and wanted to do something similar. And you can see it taking the same trajectory as Italian horror films. You can see it working itself into the same market and becoming rather indistinguishable in this Euro horror territory. But then once that period fades, you suddenly start seeing more interesting voices. You start seeing people, meaning directors, take horror seriously as an art form and create beautiful and interesting experiences. You see them start diving more into social commentary, and you see them start doing more high concepts. And when you compare all of the recent hits from Spain, you see such an extremely broad and diverse output, from Del Toro's more subtle magical horror films to something as grotesque as Wreck, to more intriguing, well-crafted films like Timecrimes, and then of course these kind of wonderful allegories as platform. So it's just an incredible journey, and I think what this says about Spain in the future is that we can expect some really interesting things.
So Chris summarised the evolution of Spanish horror really nicely there. I think it's fascinating to consider all the films that we've discussed and kind of look at it from the shifting perspective of the filmmakers and the political situation of the country itself, and how that's had an impact on the evolution of the genre. For me, I think Spanish horror is in a great place right now. The platform was a directorial debut, so I'm really looking forward to seeing more films from that director. And there's one other film that I just wanted to mention briefly. Wonderful dark fantasy called Elementary, The Blacksmith and the Devil by director Paul Urquio. This is about a blacksmith who imprisons a dangerous demon that is accidentally set free when an orphan girl stumbles upon his cage, unleashing all manner of horrors. This was released in 2017, and I'm also looking forward to seeing what else the director works on next. The set design and practical effects here are breathtaking. It's a beautiful horror with a captivating story. You can see the influences of Del Toro through it, but it also explores the dark humour of Alex de la Iglesia. So for me, I'm really excited to see where Spanish horror continues to evolve and where it will take us in the forthcoming years.
I don't really have a lot else to add. I think Tom and Chris have summed it up quite well about the way that Spanish horror is presenting itself at the moment and the interesting films that we are seeing come out. And it's really great that so many films are actually becoming available on Netflix now and are much more available than they would have been 60 years ago when they first came out. And maybe that's part of why they're progressing so well. As directors and filmmakers and film audiences are able to see all this international stuff, which sort of really helps Spanish cinema to get up its game rather than being contained for just the European market.
I think, in a way, Spanish horror films at first, in the late 60s and early 70s, carried the legacy of the Hammer Film Studio. If you look at the type of horror film Spain was making at the time, you'll see that there were a lot of films starring werewolves, vampire, even monsters like Frankenstein type of monsters, like, for example, in the awful Dr. Orlof. Also some films that took Jekyll and Hyde character. So I think it's interesting to see that at first Spain tried to appropriate to itself some famous horror and fantasy figures that were used in horror films before in the 50s and 40s in other countries. Another characteristic I would like to point out about Spanish fantasy and horror cinema is that in a typical fantasy film, reveal, let's say, of what the monster looked like is a crucial aspect, like a turning point in the film, like there is a before and after the reveal of the monster. And Spanish cinema choose not to suggest what the monster looks like. Instead, they opt for showing it right away. Chris, you mentioned about Dr. Orlof, the exposition that was very quick, a word commonly used to describe this phenomenon is fanta terror, and where the goal is to create a feeling of horror by showing the monster and not just to generate anxiety by suggesting its presence. For some, it was a way to say to the audience that this is what you're seeing is not a malfunction of the reality. The monster is here, is right in front of you, is present, and which could be seen as a social commentary of what was going on in Spain at the time. To wrap it up, yeah, I think it's fascinating to see how far Spanish horror has gone, going from very B movie type of things, very poor films, to more high budgeted type of films in the 90s and the 2000s, with directors that went on to have an international career. And I can only join everyone else by saying that I can't wait to see what Spanish horror cinema has to offer next.
Thank you, everyone. You have been listening to Talking Images, the officially unofficial podcast of the ICM Forum, which of course can always be found at icmforum.com. Join us again next time, and thank you for listening.